Welcome to the criminal imagination. Sometimes I think the silence is worse than the rage. In the first part, I tried to excavate the layers that women are trained to build, smile shaped masks laid over bruised selves. I tried to trace the contours of silence. How Vanessa said yes when she meant nothing. How Camille carved rage into her skin because words were never safe. And how Eva swallowed ambivalence until it fermented into something people mistook for cruelty. I lingered in that long pause, the space between pain and permission, where women are taught to remain calm even when they are unraveling inside. But repression doesn't disappear, it morphs, it adapts, and eventually it breaks. That's where we ended. We ended with Eva holding the maps she once sold with a pasted on smile, shattering them against a wall. A map of the file she was expected to live, cracked beyond repair. We ended with the unspoken question, can rage exist without guilt? And I said yes and no, because I have felt both. A white hot fury that doesn't care who is watching, and the aching immediate shame that comes just after, like a child told she is being too much again. But now we cross the threshold into what comes after the silence breaks. This is not a gentle terrain, because the moment she speaks, really speaks, the world flinches. The moment she stops saying it's okay and starts saying it wasn't, people start looking at her differently. When her pain stops being palatable, when it stops performing politeness, it is no longer a pain, it's a threat. And so the world calls her monstrous. I have seen it too many times in fiction, in history, in the mirror. The woman who cries in the corner is pitied, the woman who screams is punished, and the woman who stops screaming and simply acts, the woman who finally does what everyone fears she might, is no longer a woman at all. She becomes a cautionary tale, a bad example, a headline, a horror. This is a threshold, I think, in the cultural imagination, a point at which female suffering is acceptable, even expected, so long as it remains quiet. Camille, softly decaying in her mother's house, is a victim. Camille, angry and disruptive, is ungrateful. Vanessa, polite and numb, is a troubled girl. Vanessa, questioning the story she built around her abuse, is vindictive. Eva, going through the motions of motherhood while her soul calcifies, is cold. Eva, expressing anything other than maternal glow, is unnatural. The label shifts the moment she stops performing forgiveness. This is the myth of the monstrous woman. It's in the stories we tell and the ones we punish. We need to talk about what happens when women stop hiding the damage, when they stop saying it's fine and start naming names, when they take the red pen and correct the narrative. This is when the discomfort begins, not with the act itself, but with the audacity to reveal it. The moment rage is no longer a secret, and fiction knows this. The moment Vanessa stops rationalizing her abuse, the story threatens to collapse. Her entire identity, built on the lie that she was somehow in control, begins to fracture. When she admits it wasn't consent, when she lets the truth in, even in the smallest breath, the walls start to bleed. And what does she do? She silences herself again. The lie is safer, the lie is smaller, the truth is loud, messy, irreversible. So she takes the rage, folds it back in, and disappears. Camille, she's been saying it all along. Only nobody speaks her language. Her body is a cemetery of sentences no one wanted to hear. When she finally confronts the rot of her upbringing, when she faces what her mother made her believe, that pain is the only way to prove love. She doesn't shout, she collapses. And even in collapse, people call her hysterical. Eva is the clearest example of this myth's punishment. She is hated for everything she doesn't do. She doesn't coo, she doesn't gush, she doesn't hide her dread. And when her son becomes violent, the world doesn't ask what he did. They ask what she did to him. She refused the role, and the world wrote her out of the script. In all these three women, the crime isn't rage, it's exposure. The refusal to wear the costume anymore. And when the mask slips, the world doesn't say finally, it says monster. I know this fear intimately. I have been told to calm down when I wasn't even angry. I have softened my tone so I wouldn't scare people with the volume of my truth. I have apologized before expressing a single feeling. I have watched women around me, brilliant, brave women, be labeled difficult, dramatic, or dangerous simply because they refuse to make their pain ornamental. And I have asked myself, what would happen if we didn't? If we didn't shrink our grief, if we didn't delay our outrage, if we didn't make our sadness pretty or our trauma palatable, if we let the full, messy, unfeminine truth erupt, would we be called monsters too? Probably. But maybe that word is starting to lose its power. Because I am not sure the monster lives in the woman. I think it lives in the silence she was forced to keep, in the mask she was forced to wear, in the lies she had to tell to survive. Lies about who hurt her, what she wanted, what she deserved. Maybe the monster is the price of survival. Maybe what the world calls monstrous is just a woman who finally stopped lying. And maybe that's exactly what they are afraid of. Let's talk about the time when women finally break, the pattern, the rupture, and why it still terrifies us. The moment she snaps is never the beginning, it is always the end of something else. That's the illusion of the snap, this sudden rupture, this headline ready collapse, as if it comes out of nowhere, as if she woke up that morning and decided to burn it all down. But she didn't. She had been holding the match for years. She was taught to keep it tucked beneath her teeth, quiet and bitter. And when she finally lit it, when she finally let herself feel, the world said, look how dangerous she is. But rage doesn't arrive in a vacuum, it arrives in layers. That's why I keep circling this question. Why does female rage in fiction unsettle people so deeply? Why does the moment of the snap linger in cultural memory more than the years of silent endurance that came before it? It's because we are far more comfortable watching a woman suffer than watching her stop suffering. Pain is acceptable when it's passive. The moment she turns it outward, the moment she speaks, screams, hits back, the audience flinches. She breaks the fourth wall of femininity. because she was supposed to survive quietly. The literary canon is full of these women. Women who cross the line, who stop performing pain politely, women who fracture. Media is one of the oldest. Betrayed, discarded, exiled, and then turned monstrous. She kills her own children, and her name becomes synonymous with horror. But rarely, but rarely, people talk about the thousand small betrayals that lead her there. The marriage she sacrificed everything for, the children she bore in a foreign land, the abandonment, the humiliation. Her story is reduced to the act, not the accumulation. And that's the pattern. The snap is isolated from its context. It is made to look like madness when it is often simply the final refusal. In My Dark Vanessa, we see a quieter version of this. Vanessa never has a dramatic outburst. No one ever sees her scream, but her mind snaps, slowly, silently over the years. And when it does, it isn't catharsis, it is disorientation. Her whole narrative begins to buckle. The man she thought she loved was a predator. The love she believed in was a manipulation. And the consent she clung to was a cage. Vanessa's snap is not cinematic. It is not a scene. It's a long unraveling. A story that stops making sense. And that too is kind of violence. Not against others, but against the structure she built to stay alive. In Sharp Objects, Camille is another kind of fracture. She carries her history etched into her skin. Her snap is already written. We meet her post break. Every scar is a sentence she couldn't say. And when she returns to her hometown, she doesn't explode. She absorbs. She holds the secrets until they rot her from the inside. Her rage never looks like rage, it looks like collapse. But the snap is there. It just doesn't always look like a scream. Sometimes it's a whisper that finally says, no more. I think we crave these moments in fiction because we want to believe in justice. Not the justice of law, but of narrative. We want the moment of the snap to mean something, to feel like a triumph. We want Vanessa to scream in court. We want Camille to expose her mother. We want Eva to be believed, finally, irrevocably. But rage rarely offers that kind of clarity. It doesn't cleanly map into a plot. Trauma doesn't climax, it loops. That's the cruelty of it. When trauma is suppressed for too long, the act of release doesn't bring peace. It brings fragmentation. A woman who breaks is not always healed by it. Sometimes she just breaks. And this is where the fantasy of fiction diverges from the mess of reality. In fiction, we often want rage to restore order, to realign the moral arc. We want the abuser punished, the survivor vindicated, the ending earned. But real rage isn't neat, it isn't necessarily heroic, and it doesn't always make sense to anyone outside the woman feeling it. That's what unsettles us. Because we don't just fear female anger, we fear what it reveals, how long we ignored it, how deeply we misunderstood her, how complicit we may have been in her silence. There is a scene in We Need to Talk About Kevin that never leaves me. It's not the climax, not the blood, not even the murder. It's the soundless private moment when Eva, long before the worst, smashes her husband's lovingly hung maps with a golf club. There is no music, no speech, just glass breaking and breathlessness. Her entire life mapped out, shattered, a woman told to be grateful, gentle, giving, breaking something beautiful because it no longer feels like hers. This is the real snap. Not the courtroom, not the confession. That. Because it's not just about the child, it's about the woman who wasn't allowed to feel. And when she finally does, when the rage breaks surface, there is no applause, there is just silence. That silence is important because after the snap, there is no return to before. People don't forgive the woman who breaks. They tolerate her, maybe. They dissect her. They pathologize her. But they do not restore her. She has already broken her contract with the world, the one that says she will endure pain gracefully and keep smiling through the fire. Once broken, she cannot be trusted again. She knows what it feels like to stop pretending, and now she might do it again. So, what do we do? We contain these women in fiction, but we frame them as cautionary tales. Camille is a warning, Vanessa is a blur, Eva is a monster, media is a myth. And yet, we return to them. We study them. We quote them. We turn them into stories because we know there is something honest buried inside that rupture. Something that calls to our own fractures, the part of us that knows how close we are to snapping too. That's what makes the device so powerful and so dangerous. Because the woman who breaks in fiction is never just a character, she's a mirror. And if you look too long, you might see yourself. Wayne C. Booth in the Rhetoric of Fiction argues that narrative is never neutral. Every story, even when dressed in realism, is a rhetorical act, an intentional persuasion. The implied author, as Booth famously terms it, is always persuading us not just what to feel, but how and when to feel it. This has profound implications when we examine how female rage, particularly the moment of rupture or the so called snap, is constructed in fiction. In Booth's framework, the ethical appeal, ethos of the narrator or of the woman herself when she tells her story becomes a site of friction. Female protagonists who repress pain for chapters, who quietly endure, accrue ethical credit with the reader. They are virtuous, contained bearers of invisible weight. But the moment they break, the narrative tone often shifts. Booth would point us to the rhetorical slippage here. The implied author subtly distances us. The narration becomes sharper, colder, even skeptical. Her rage, though long earned, is no longer rhetorically acceptable. This dissonance is no accident. It reveals a bias encoded in narrative construction itself. As Booth reminds us, fiction is an exercise in moral shaping. Readers are persuaded to judge, forgive, or condemn based on the author's orchestration of sympathy. And too often, when it comes to women, the orchestration turns punitive the moment rage breaches the frame. Take Eva in We Need to Talk About Kevin. Her refusal to maternal warmth, her intellectualism, her raw dislike of Kevin, these are rendered with an ambiguous ethos. The narrative subtly begs the reader to ask, can she be trusted? Is she a bad mother or a truth teller? Booth would remind us that this ambiguity is not neutral. It is a rhetorical stance. The implied author has chosen not to grant Eva the same clarity of moral authority we afford male narrators in distress. In this way, Booth's rhetoric of fiction helps us see that the snap isn't merely a plot point. It is a moral event in the narrative arc, a moment where the reader is invited, sometimes coerced, to decide whether her rage is understandable or unforgivable. And more often than not, her punishment is built into the prose. Booth teaches us that all fiction is argument. The storyteller is not merely describing a world, but constructing a moral universe, shaping the reader's ethical stance through tone, structure, and silence. And so, when we encounter female rage in fiction, we must ask, what is the narrator asking us to believe about this anger, about this woman? Booth would call this the ethical dimension of narrative. He urges us to recognize that characters are more than vehicles for plot. They are rhetorical invitations. The text, through its construction of voice, sympathy, and judgment, is teaching us how to read not only the characters' actions but their very selves. Rage in this framework becomes a moral signal, and depending on how the author frames it, a woman's fury can either damn her or deliver her. In most fiction, it does both. Let's begin with Camille Preaker in Sharp Objects. Her rage is not theatrical. It isn't media storm or Ophelia's decay. It is quiet, recursive, bleeding inward. Her body becomes her narrative voice. Carved with words she cannot speak aloud, her skin fragmented, she is not offered a reliable ethos. Her narration is distrusting of itself. She doubts her memories, hesitates mid sentence, leaves things unsaid. The implied author, through this fractured perspective, presents Camille's rage not as righteous but as pathological. And yet, and yet we, the readers, begin to trust her more than the world around her. Why? Because Booth also teaches us that ethos is not fixed. It evolves through narrative labor. As Camille revisits her childhood, her mother's gaslighting, her sister's death, her readers begin to perform what Booth would call ethical reconstruction. We rejudge her not as a mad woman, but as a woman with knowledge. Her pain at last becomes epistemic. It teaches us something about women, about violence, about the cruelty of elegant houses and the mothers who poison from the inside out. Camille does not become a hero, but Booth might say the implied author allows us to revise our moral contract with her. We do not forgive her pain, we begin to respect it. Vanessa, in My Dark Vanessa, is even more treacherous territory. She does not scream, she does not accuse. She insists to herself, to us, that what happened to her was not rape. Booth reminds us that the narrator's ethos is built in part on our willingness to trust her judgment, and here that judgment is deeply unreliable. Vanessa's entire voice is shaped by grooming, her syntax, her reasoning, her view of consent, all colonized by Strain's manipulation. She is, in Boothian terms, a damaged narrator, but not dishonest, not malicious, just entangled. What Booth offers us, especially in this concept of distance, is a way to read between her sentences. The implied author, Russell, keeps a painful, almost surgical distance from Vanessa's voice. She does not correct her, she does not editorialize. She simply lets us watch Vanessa justifies her trauma for 300 pages and then slowly, quietly begin to unthread it. Rage in this novel is the most controlled of all. So controlled it becomes indistinguishable from denial. And yet, by the end, we glimpse it, not in a scream, but in a line about not remembering the last time she was a child. Booth might argue that the narrative earns its rhetorical power not through revelation but restraint. Vanessa's effect is not the absence of emotion, it is what has been controlled too long. And when it slips even slightly, the moral gravity shifts. In We Need to Talk About Kevin, Eva's rage is visible from the start, but it is shaped. Booth would say to discredit her. The narration is sharp, intelligent, but emotionally alienating. She writes to her estranged husband in letters, a cold literary form, and fills them with intellectual bitterness. The implied author invites the reader to question her from the beginning. Is she a narcissist, a failed mother? Is her dislike of Kevin responsible for the horror that follows? Booth's concept of the implied reader becomes crucial here. Lionel Shriver crafts Eva's ethos to be a suspect, so we must work harder, read deeper, to reach empathy. Booth would call this rhetorical complexity. The story refuses to give us simple answers, and in that refusal, it gives us something more potent, an ethical crisis. Eva's rage is not performative. She doesn't cry for help, she simply exists in a state of moral revulsion at her son, at the expectations of motherhood, at the social lie that biology guarantees affection. Eva is a rare case of rhetorically earned unreliability. She tells us things we don't want to hear and we doubt her, not because she is wrong, but because she violates our emotional expectations of a grieving mother. This is the crux of female rage in fiction. It rarely aligns with the rhetorical script audiences are prepared for. Rage that is too controlled, too cool, too precise, like in Eva. Rage that never erupts but haunts silently, like in Vanessa. Rage that wounds the self rather than the world, as in Camille. Booth helps us see that these choices are not narrative accidents, they are rhetorical strategies, choices made by authors to interrogate the moral biases of the reader. And yet, in each of these books, something remarkable happens. The reader learns. Despite the narrative suspicion, despite the slow burning build, each woman's affect begins to educate us. Camille's carved skin becomes scripture. Vanessa's silence becomes testimony. Eva's coldness becomes prophecy. They are not martyrs. Their pain is not passive, nor are they monsters. Their rage is not sadistic. They are women who have spent too long under the surface of what fiction allows. The rhetoric of fiction is always about control, who gets to tell the story, and how much moral credit they are granted. So perhaps the ultimate reframing is this: rage is not the opposite of control. Rage is what has been controlled for too long. When the story finally permits it to emerge, in Vanessa's pause, in Camille's hesitation, in Eva's shattering of maps, it does not read like justice. It reads like knowledge. Pain shaped into clarity, fury filtered through syntax. It is the kind of moral education Booth respected most. Not the moral of a tale, but the act of ethical witnessing. We have not vindicated, but illuminated. Sometimes the rage doesn't arrive like a storm. Sometimes the storm has already passed, and all that is left is the truth it buried, the lie that it held everything in place, splintered like glass under bare feet. When we speak of women who snap, we often talk about the moment, the outburst, the act, the weapon, the blood. But I think we miss something quieter, something far more dangerous. The moment she stops lying. Lying that she's fine, that it didn't hurt, that she wanted it, that she deserved it, that she loves her child unconditionally, that she doesn't remember, that she remembers wrong, that she doesn't want revenge, that she wouldn't dare, that it's okay, that she's okay, that she doesn't mind. Sometimes the lie snaps before she does. When I think of Camille, I think of the mirror, the way she looks at her body not as flesh but as history. A map of words she couldn't say aloud, a quiet rage that never set fire to anyone else but carved itself into her skin with brutal fluency. What was repressed has already spoken. The blade was never violence, it was translation. Vanessa, she was never angry, not out loud. But the most terrifying thing about her story isn't what she said, it's what she believed, what she had to believe to keep surviving. The lie she kept feeding herself just to stay in one piece. And when it broke, when she let it break, it didn't sound like fury. It sounded like breath, like waking up after a long and dangerous dream. And Eva, oh Eva, she refused to become the mother they all demanded, who said no without ever shouting it, who knew her son was a storm from the start and carried that guilt like a second skin. Her rage was never a rupture, it was a refusal, a slow erosion of the mask until she stood there finally alone and human. Each of these women taught me something, not about rage, but about language. That sometimes the thing we call fury is actually fluency. A woman speaking in her truest voice for the first time in her life. The scream might come later or not at all. In my mind, the final shot lingers. A woman walking away, her back to the wreckage. The sound is quiet, no music, no dramatic cue, just footsteps. And a door, somewhere, closing. Maybe we don't know what she's leaving behind. Maybe we don't need to. Because she wasn't angry. She was finally fluent. And this is where we will go next. Not into silence, but into suit and tie mythologies. Into works like American Psycho, Talented Mr. Ripley, into My Sister, the Serial Killer, into immaculate lies and charismatic destruction, into teeth behind a smile and knives in designer pockets. The question I want to ask you is this: what do we love about monsters? Why do we forgive them, follow them, fall in love with them? And why is that when women destroy, we call it horror, but when men destroy, we call it style? But that's for next set of books. For now, hold your fire and listen to the silence after the lie breaks. because sometimes that's the real story. Until next time, this has been The Criminal Imagination. Thank you for listening.